My name is Nancy Griffin, and I'm a private consultant right now and a full-time volunteer with a number of organizations, including our local area agency on aging, for whom I do housing access consulting. We go into the homes of older homeowners and basically look at whether or not they need additional safety, like grab bars or handrails, or if they need real access with bathroom modifications or ramps or other kinds of additions. We do this with grant funds, and it's very exciting because sometimes with just a very little bit of effort, we can make people feel much safer and much more confident that they can stay in their homes. And it's been remarkable, the folks that we've met in the course of doing this over the last 3 years. I've been involved with the disability rights movement since 1976, when I took a day off of work from my state employment in Springfield, Illinois, and drove up to Chicago because I'd heard about this new federal law about education for children with disabilities. And I wanted to see, since one of the 6 federally held field hearings was going to be in Chicago, who came and what they had to say. So my boss gave me the day off, and I drove up to Chicago, this great big hotel, and asked where the hearing was, and was directed down a long hallway like we see here, and finally got to this huge room that was packed, standing room only, with parents and children with disabilities, and adults with disabilities, and dogs, and big wheelchairs, and walkers, and we all come with lots of equipment. And there was a big center aisle in the room, and a stage up front, and there was a stenographer sitting on the stage just taking down dictation, and a microphone at the front of the center aisle. And there were people lined up all the way to the back of the ballroom and out the door waiting to speak. And I worked my way around to the back side of the room and finally found a seat and sat there. I had gotten there at about 9:30 in the morning. The hearing started at 9. I sat there till 4 in the afternoon when I got up, and I went back into the hotel to try to find a payphone because I had to call my boss to tell him that I was not coming home until this was over, and it obviously was going to go on another day. And it ended up going on 3 days, and I heard some of the most powerful stories I've ever heard in my life. And it touched me so deeply because when I was a little girl and had to have a series of surgeries, my school superintendent told my parents that children like Nancy don't go to school. So I missed 3.5 years of grade school just because I was in a cast, even though my school was accessible. So that really touched me. I went back to Springfield and got on the horn and called every member of the Illinois delegation to Congress and said, you must pass this law. The National Council on Disability, at that time led by Lex Frieden, was looking at all of these different issues and how we were having to just basically, put the finger in the dike to try to fix one here and one there, and came out with a report whose name escapes me at the moment, but I'm sure you would know what it is. In 1988, that basically was a call to action across a broad array of issues, but it was focused on civil rights as this is what this is. These are civil rights issues. And the next year they generated another report, but at that time the chairman of the council was an incredible man who wore a soft dove-colored gray hat. And I'm blanking. Justin Dart. And Justin took that first document and got in his little red pickup truck with his wife and took off and drove across this country and visited people with disabilities in every single state. The next year, the National Council published what was the precursor of the ADA. It was a call for legislation. And Lex and Justin and the good folks there really sat down and started writing what would become the ADA. And Justin and his wife, Yoshiko, took off in their little red pickup truck again and did another 50-state tour. And went around meeting with folks with disabilities and family members all over this country and selling us on, we can do this. We have power. We can change the way our lives are. We can do this. And he was so compelling. And you just couldn't say no to Justin. So he engaged tens of thousands of people with disabilities through his personal travels. It was an army of people who went to work on passage of this bill once it was introduced. Another thing about Justin that I learned during this whole process was that he was determined that he was going to find a way to get to the president on this, the first President Bush. And he didn't have the right connections to do that because he was a Democrat. But he knew the man who became the president's chief of staff personally. And so Justin thought, maybe if I can get to him, I can get to the president. So this started way back, even before the legislation was introduced, but he was obviously already working on it. He started asking him to go to dinner with him to discuss various issues affecting people with disabilities. And he would purposely take him to some nice place in Washington somewhere, and it wouldn't be accessible. Justin used a wheelchair. So this giant of a man would have to lift Justin and carry him into the restaurant and then go back and get his wheelchair and carry it into the restaurant. Justin managed never to find an accessible restaurant in Washington, D.C., and they had dinner at least once a month for a year and a half. So it finally got down to crunch time and the ADA was really about to go to the president's desk. Justin went back and he said, "Do we have to have dinner again?" The chief of staff said, "No, the president will sign the bill." One other story that I know about, because I know Pat Wright from DREDF so well, and Liz Savage was involved in this too, our speaker tomorrow morning. When it came time to define what is a place of public accommodation under the law, the bill just said places of public accommodation. It didn't say what that was, and nobody had really had time to sit down and figure out, well, how do we define this so we know that we get as broad a coverage as possible. And Pat and Liz and one other person, I can't think who that was, were outside the house in the cloakroom, and they saw a stack of yellow pages in the corner. And they sat down on the floor of the cloakroom and went through the yellow pages of Washington, D.C., looking at the categories of businesses. And if you look at what's in the ADA, it follows the yellow pages. And that's how they came up with what is a place of public accommodation that's as broad as we could possibly make it. I went to the Governor's Council for People with Disabilities and said, we're going to have to train people on how to do this. And I didn't have an organization behind me at the time. I was doing private consulting like I am now. And so one of the members of the council, a gentleman by the name of Costa N. Miller, agreed with me heartily and agreed that his organization and some of its members would sponsor a program to train people on this new legislation if the council would support it. So I wrote a grant application to the Governor's Council, and 7 months later, the ADA Training Network was established in Indiana. We had offices in North, Central, and Southern Indiana. We had expert staff who were trained in the DREDF National Training Program, which I also got the opportunity to participate in. And we went forth and trained anyone who would listen on what the ADA said and what the requirements were and how to meet those. And to its credit, the council continued the funding of that program for 6 years, which is much longer than typical council funding. But we actually were invited to do training nationally because the folks that we had were so good. I think the greatest impact of the ADA is the empowerment of people with disabilities in this country. The fact that now people with disabilities can view themselves as full participating citizens, much more so than ever before. There's been a huge impact in terms of just physical access to our communities, but we've still got a long ways to go there. The new law that passed last year that really puts much of the really critical definitions back into place, and the regulations that are coming out now to implement that, we really have to do the same thing again. We have to get out and train people so that they understand what the requirements are now, so that folks with disabilities who have been denied protections because of court decisions now have those protections back, and to be sure that people with disabilities know what their rights are and how to exercise those.